Namaste, and thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event. And I think that we are kind of united in a sense in terms of our search for the truth, seeking the truth. And of course, truth can take many forms and many perspectives. And what our Vedas talk about is there is only one truth, but learned people look at it from many different directions. So what I'm going to talk about, and thank you very much for your introduction, Indra, and the ceremony, as well as Suresh's words, is that I'm going to talk about Bhagwad Gita in a slightly different perspective. So as Suresh mentioned, that Bhagwad Gita can be taken as a spiritual guide, as a manual of life and living. That's what I call it. It can be taken as a religious text as well, of course. And also, which is my speciality, is to explore the intersection between spirituality and psychology. And when I look at and read and teach Bhagwad Gita, I see a huge content of psychological material because it describes the nature of the mind. It describes the nature of the mind in relationship to the world around. It describes the characteristics of the mind and how it functions. Why? Because the mind is the key element in our spiritual journey. And what Bhagavad Gita says is that as your mind, so your self. As your mind, so your life. And changing your way in which you believe, changing your attitude, changing your choices will result in a transformation of yourself. So I will explain some of the psychological concepts in relationship to stress and to try and understand, first of all, what stress is. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Yes. Okay. So here we start with trying to understand, first of all, what do we really mean by stress and how can Bhagavad Gita help us to manage stress in our daily life. And some people say, why do you talk about stress in relationship to Bhagavad Gita? Because it's as if you're kind of, bringing it down to a level where we are talking about day-to-day anxiety. Bhagavad Gita is not really about that. Of course, it's not. But all the techniques which Bhagavad Gita talks about and Lord Krishna gives to Arjun in his state of extreme anxiety will also help all of us in terms of managing stress. So first of all, then what is stress? This is what we're going to talk about. I'm also going to give you an overview of the Bhagavad Gita in relationship to the whole journey of a person, of a human being, in the condition of Arjun as he finds himself in the middle of the battlefield in a state of crisis. Right up to the 18th chapter, when Lord Krishna tells him, okay, are you ready now to fight? Where he stands up and starts his fighting. And what is it that has happened between the first chapter and the last chapter, where he has now got this kind of way in which he is able to not only meet his own crisis, but also the external crisis of the board itself. And then to see how the spiritual solution for stress is given in the Bhagavad Gita. So these are the three areas I'm going to talk about. So what is stress? So if you think about stress, first of all, there is an element of capacity, is that we think about ourselves as having a certain capacity for doing this, that, and the other. Whether it's the most challenging thing in your life, or whether it's just making a cup of tea, do I have a capacity to deal with what I need to deal with? Capacity. Number two, it kind of expresses itself is, I don't know how to do it, I can't do it. And the other element which is related to the capacity is the demand. In other words, there are demands which are made on me, and I make some demands on myself. And whether there is a kind of capacity to deal with this demand comes by asking ourselves, or somebody telling us, you need to do it. You want to do it. You have to do it. Okay. So this balance between the two, capacity on one hand and demand on the other. And if there's imbalance between the two, where the demand looks greater than the capacity to deal with it, then what is going to happen? There's going to be stress. In other words, stress is experience when the demand is greater than capacity. And it could apply to the simplest things in our life, or it can apply to a major challenge in our life. So this way of thinking is that we've got to understand that capacity and demand are both perceived capacity and perceived demand. In other words, what I perceive as my capacity is subject to change. In other words, it's not a fixed item. Similarly, demand is also a perceived demand, which means that somebody can look at a challenge and it means nothing to them. But to me, it may be the greatest challenge in my life. Why? Because I perceive that in a different way through all the filters of belief and attitude through which I'm looking at the challenge. So it is a perceived capacity, perceived demand, and we have to remember that, because if it is not perceived, then it is a fixed thing. And therefore, if it is a fixed thing, then we are going to experience stress all the time. In other words, there is no way of managing the stress. Managing the stress comes through changing our perception about our capacity, or changing our perception about the demand which is being placed on us. So when perceived demand is greater than perceived capacity, stress is the result. Okay, so keeping this very simple model in mind, then we look at what is stress. You can explain it in a psychological way, is that the old brain is the fight, flight, freeze center. When feeling overburdened, anxious, we are feeling nervous, unhappy, have fear, difficulty in making decisions, irritable, biting nails, unable to concentrate. These are the symptoms of stress. And as we know, this is a very, very common thing throughout humanity, is that everybody will experience some kind of level of stress, or some kind of stress throughout their lives. And especially during COVID times, all of us experience an increased stress level, because the demands which were being made on us, whether it was in the house or outside the house, demands which came from all over the place, including the virus itself, and the capacity to deal with that was very limited in some cases. And you can imagine that, I remember that, while I was doing the counseling and psychotherapy, there was a 500% increase in depression, as well as domestic violence. And this is all because of stress. So what is stress? Again, it is activated when perception of demand outweighs the perception of capacity to meet the demand. And it's a series of physiological, physical responses which are then activated. And then we have got, this kind of way in which, sorry, I can't see the bottom line, but give me 1 minute. Okay, so recognizing stress, I'm sure that, all of you recognize when you are under stress, okay? And what happens is that there are various ways of recognizing the stress: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Anyway, so these are the ways in which we're going to recognize: physical, headaches, illnesses, sleeplessness; mental, making mistakes, getting confused, forgetting things; avoiding decision, crisis mindset, emotional, and so on and so on. Spiritual as well is that we can feel lost because we have kind of had this way of not having meaning in our lives, no longer valued. What's the point of doing this, that, and the other? So it can come from all directions, right? And these are the kind of demands which can be made on us and will begin to give these kind of symptoms in terms of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. So dealing with stress, how do we really deal with stress? Number one is to become aware of situations that cause stress. We are constantly under this autopilot because the mind, just like Bhagavan Krishna talks about in the Bhagwad Gita, is that the mind has this way in which it repeats itself as a kind of patterned thinking, patterned feeling, patterned behavior. And therefore, to get out of this autopilot, reactive mode of functioning is what we have to first of all recognize, is that somebody presses our button, immediately we go into a state of stress. So become aware of situations which cause stress. Learn to anticipate when your stress is likely to arise. And learn why the stress tends to arise, perceived demand, or is it perceived capacity? And then use the methods to reduce stress in the moment and practice long-term management. I'm still giving you this psychological way of understanding stress, okay? Why I'm doing is because I will relate all this, which I'm telling you, to the way in which Bhagwad Gita talks about its own methodology of how to deal with the mind and how to deal with stress. So let's look at the Bhagwad Gita. And I'm going to give you an overview of what it talks about. Okay, so when we talk about Bhagwad Gita, there is a way in which we can look at the vision of the Bhagwad Gita and the teachings of the Gita. And it is one of the most well-known scriptures of the Hindu tradition. Of course, many great thinkers from our time, such as Albert Einstein, Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer, have all kind of read it again, like explored it and contemplated on it, deliberated upon its message. And it's regarded as an integral part of the Mahabharata, composed by Ved Vyasa, who is the composer of the Mahabharata as well as the Bhagavad Gita at the beginning of the present age, which is called the Kali Yuga. And the Bhagavad Gita can be dated, well, dates, will be different according to your own perspective and thinking, but it's said to be around 3000 BC. Let's not worry about the date because sometimes it says, when did Kali Yuga start? Somebody has given an exact date, February 1813, 3102 BC. Well, that may be right, that may not be right. What it means is that Bhagavad Gita is an ancient text. And some people, say, if it's an ancient text, why don't you leave it there? Why bring it into contemporary thinking? And there's a very good reason for that. Bhagavad Gita, although it is ancient, it has got the human condition, which is explored and reflected upon. And that human condition is the same it was 40,000 years ago as it is now. The human mind is still functioning in the way it was functioning 40,000 years ago. Maybe there's few changes here and there, but the brain structure, the way it functions, the way the mind functions, still the same. And the human condition itself, the existential condition of human beings, still remains the same. And therefore, dealing with this fundamental existential issues together with the nature of the mind, which has remained the same, it still applies in our contemporary world. It is seen as a practical manual of life and living. And it consists of 18 chapters, 700 verses, shlokas, which then goes through the details of how one can attain self-transformation through the guidance of the Gita. So fundamental questions about life and living answered in the Bhagavad Gita as part of the Mahabharata. meaning, purpose, and values of life, individual identity, the world and God, choices, actions, and its place in our spiritual development, and the place of devotion and knowledge in terms of a spiritual pathway. So all these are fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, values of life. And what Arjun is actually experiencing in the middle of the battlefield is that he, being one of the top generals and warriors and leaders of that time, comes to a state in which he is completely deflated. He is in a state of crisis because there's a crisis of identity, there's a crisis about his own meaning, purpose, values, and he no longer knows what to do. And therefore his question to Lord Krishna is that, tell me what to do, number one, and tell me what is good for me. Tell me what to do, tell me what is good for me. These are questions which we ask ourselves even now. Okay, tell me what to do, and that's why you're here. Maybe I'm telling you what to do in terms of stress. And tell me how to do it. Tell me what is good for me. In other words, what is the purpose of life, which is this is going to contribute towards. So the flow of thought, and this is the Advaita Vedanta interpretation, as we know that there are many different interpretations of the Bhagwad Gita. And because I belong to this tradition of Advaita Vedanta, which is a non-dual tradition, here's the interpretation. The crisis of Arjun in the middle of the battlefield, he is under extreme stress and refuses to fight in spite of being a great warrior. And is representative of the human condition, inner and outer conflict. We are all going through inner and outer conflict day in, day out, whether in small bits or whether as large challenges. And subjective identity is separated from the rest of the world, seeking reconnection. Again, Advaita Vedanta interpretation is that our own sense of who we are has become fragmented and separated from this unity of the truth. And therefore, when I become apart from the truth by this kind of subjectivity and my subjective identity, I begin to suffer. Okay. And this is really one of the basic concepts in terms of the guidance of the Gita, is that how do you make this reconnection to the truth? And how do you make your consciousness to unite with that which is the pure consciousness? And the whole guidance is in terms of how to use all your resources, including the transactional life, including your heart and your feelings, including your mind and your intellect. How do you use these resources to make that reconnection? And some of you will be familiar with the word yoga, right? Yoga means union. And this union is between what? It is the union between individual consciousness and the infinite consciousness, pure consciousness, which is the substratum of all existence. As much as we get pulled out of that union, as much as we get disconnected from the truth, our suffering begins to increase more and more. And this is what Arjuna is experiencing in the middle of the battlefield. And therefore, the guidance which is given to him is in terms of yoga and the four pathways of yoga, which is described in the Bhagwad Gita. I'll come to that in a minute. So the guidance then is a solution to the Arjuna crisis. There are lessons to be learned. What is the Arjuna crisis? It's a crisis of meaning, purpose, and values. It's a crisis of identity. It's a crisis of choice. And how these lessons are going to be learned is that here are the lessons. Very, very simply put, Lord Krishna is telling him, do not grieve as you are not this physical entity you have taken yourself to be, but your truth is that you are this eternal Brahman, pure consciousness, pure existence, pure bliss. And you've taken yourself to be this very limited ego identity. And in that particular form of your own identity, you are grieving because you think that your teachers, your gurus, your kith and kin are going to be destroyed in this war. In order to go beyond suffering, liberation from samsara, that is your purpose. And this liberation from samsara means the cycle of birth and death, okay? Samsara also means your day-to-day living. But this cycle of birth and death where we come back again and again, this idea of reincarnation, very much part of our Hindu tradition. And this is to be done by realization of your true nature, Brahman, through living in the world in a certain way with the guidance of the Gita. So this is the overall scheme of the flow of thought in terms of Bhagwad Gita. Okay, here we are, Arjuna in a crisis. He is being told, this is what you need to kind of go through. You don't have to grieve because you're mistaken yourself to be this physical entity, which you are not. In truth, you are the eternal Brahman. And let's reframe your experience in the middle of the battlefield through this different framework of thinking, which is the spiritual framework within which now you're going to discover the solution to your crisis. So in terms of the idea of yoga as the key for dealing with stress, okay? So there are two verses which actually define what yoga is, not in the way in which we normally think about yoga or Patanjali talks about yoga. What it says, perform action or Dhananjaya, which is another name for Arjun, abandoning attachment, being steadfast in yoga and balanced in success and failure. Evenness of mind is called yoga. This is called samatvam bhava, evenness of the mind, a steady equilibrium in the mind. Secondly, endowed with wisdom of evenness of the mind, one cast off in this life all deeds. Therefore, devote yourself to yoga. Skill in action is yoga. So two dimensions of our life. One is the mental dimension, evenness of mind. One is our transactional dimension, day-to-day dealings with the world around us. Both these things can be reshaped, reconditioned by this way of functioning. And you can see the key words here: abandoning attachment, steadfast in yoga, balance in success and failure, evenness of mind, casting off all kind of deeds which are not conducive to your journey, and devoting yourself to yoga. And the spiritual journey described in the Bhagwad Gita is about 3 stages: purification, and this purification is about getting away from this limited sense of who I am. Then perfection in terms of our mental apparatus, making our mind to be perfect for meditation, and through meditation, realization of our true self. Okay, and therefore, this is the method by which we can go beyond all stress. In fact, stress does not exist when we transcend our sense of identity, when we transcend our own mind. So let's look at the spiritual solution for stress. And again, I'm going to kind of offer some, overviews of the Bhagavad Gita as to how we can think about this. So I've already mentioned that, Bhagavad Gita is about a dialogue between Arjun, the warrior, who is a human representative, and Bhagwan Shri Krishna, who is the divine teacher, sitting in the chariot, driving Arjuna's chariot, and Arjuna is sitting in the back in this condition of crisis. And this dialogue takes place between Arjun and Krishna. And Krishna gives him the guidance of how to get out of his state of crisis and stand up and then do what he needs to do, which is that he's a warrior, and in the middle of the battlefield, his duty, as it were, is to stand up and fight. So we may think, okay, what has that got to do with stress? Okay, so I'll try to explain the connection between the kind of overview of the Bhagavad Gita and the guidance from the Gita as to how we can um, get some guidance about the management of stress and indeed relief of stress. So just to remind ourselves, stress is the imbalance between perceived demand, perceived capacity that leads to stress. And that when perceived demand is greater than perceived capacity, what results is the experience of stress. So Gita's frameworks for learning and change. Now, this is an interesting part. And I was telling you about the psychological aspects of the Bhagavad Gita. Indeed, this is a way in which Bhagavad Gita talks about the human condition, the human mind, the human nature, and how it is affected by the past conditioning. So what it means, the technical word for that is vasanas. So past conditioning is all that we have experienced, not only in this life, but the past life as well, is that we are constantly having impressions coming through our senses. Even at this moment, impressions are coming through your sight, your hearing, what I'm talking about. It is creating an impression in your mind. And that impression, when it comes back again and again and again, it will create a certain inclination and tendency in the mind. So this past conditioning is what we are carrying at a subliminal level of the mind. Okay, so we may not know what our vasanas are, what his past conditioning is in complete detail, but we know the effect of that is the thought and the feeling and the experience which arises in the mind of which we are conscious. Past conditioning is subliminal. It is not available in our awareness, but the thought and the feeling and the experience is available to us right now. And it consists of three things: intentions, beliefs, and attitudes. So this intention, attitude, and belief make up the past conditioning. We have got certain beliefs which we have picked up along our journey. We have certain attitudes, certain intentions, which we have now gathered together as inclination and tendencies. And these are related to the body, the mind, and the intellect. Sensations, feelings, and thoughts. And this then becomes the way in which we function in our day-to-day life. Okay, it leads to actions and reactions. And this will sound familiar because modern psychology also talks about the subconscious mind and the conscious mind and how beliefs, attitude, intentions are actually the ones which drive not only the mind and its processes, but also how we function in our day-to-day life. And this is what was talked about in the Bhagwad Gita 5,000 years ago. And this is called, we can call it the ego operating system. And this ego operating system is about me as this ego individual identity, the me and the mind. Me as this body, mind, intellect, ego individual, and mine, everything I have become attached to in terms of defining myself. This is my house, and therefore I identify this as my house, and anything that happens to the house also, in a sense, happens to me. Okay? So me and my ego individual, ego operating system. And attachments, mine, identification, me, is the source of our stress. So according to Bhagavad Gita, my identification as this limited ego individual limits the way in which I think about my capacity as this individual. Just like Arjun said, I can't find because I don't have the capacity to fight. My attachments also create a limitation in terms of what I can do, what I can't do. So it limits the capacity. On the other hand, there are challenges always coming from internally, externally. And therefore, this limitedness of the ego individual gives rise to this stress. So here's the ego operating system, as I have just explained, which then, according to the Bhagwad Gita guidance, needs to become a dharma operating system. Dharma is a big word, of course, we know. But in this case, dharma is related to our day-to-day choices and transactions. And dharma means what is my dharma is according to my station and stage in life. Am I a householder? Therefore, my dharma as a householder. Am I a student? My dharma as a student. Am I a vanaprastha or a senior person? Then my dharma will be different from that of the student. So my station and stage of life. I'm a father. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a son. I'm a brother, sister. All these different roles, together with the stage and station of my life, will determine what is my dharma in a very broad sense. So what Bhagwad Gita tells us how to go from the ego operating system through the discipline and the control of the senses and the mind and our intellect to the dharma operating system, and then to the God operating system, where something else takes over. We are no longer this ego individual, but we are the infinite truth. And this ego operating system is self-centered, selfishness is there, attachment is there. It is all about me and mine. Dharma operating system is God-centered, selflessness, detachment. It is about thee and thine. And the God operating system is humanity-centered. There is no self or ego. There's only love and compassion for everything. And it works according to the divine design. Okay. And this first part of going from ego operating system to the Dharma operating system, according to the Bhagwad Gita, is the process of purification of our ego individuality and our beliefs and our intentions and our attitudes, changing all these things. And then from the Dharma operating system to the God operating system is self-realization. Okay, so this is the kind of setup which Bhagwad Gita is talking about. It's framework for inner transformation and self-realization. Again, coming back to stress. Stress is going to considerably reduce if we go through this process of purification by going from the ego operating system to the Dharma operating system, and disappears completely when we go from the Dharma operating system to the God operating system. And when Arjun has been guided by Krishna, he is now functioning more according to the Dharma operating system, so that his level of stress has gone down, so that he can now stand up and fight and meet the challenge. Okay, so this is a transformation track, and it is a synthesis of the three parts of yoga: karma yoga, to do with our path of action; bhakti yoga, which is the path of devotion; and jnana yoga, which is the path of knowledge. It is a synthesis of all this. So I mentioned about the vasanas. Swabhav is our inner temperament. We change that inner temperament by karma yoga, bhakti yoga. And this is called svadharma, living our life in a dharmic way. And then we discover our true nature, our svarupa, by the path of knowledge. And related to that, first of all, it is the ego, me and mine. And then we become a karma yogi, which means that we abandon attachments. And thirdly, we renounce our identity, which is called sannyas. So you can see there is a kind of systematic development of this whole idea of inner transformation. This is called the transformation track. This is what I call the transformation track. And it goes from having this a certain inner temperament, changing it into something else, and then finally realizing who we truly are. And then here's the way in which Bhagwad Gita deals about. The first 6th chapter of the Bhagwad Gita is talking about the problem of Arjun and Arjun crisis. Shoka Moha Bhaya, Jiva Vishada, which means the grief of the individual human being. And it is about grief, it is about delusion, it's about anxiety. This is our existential condition. We are all going to experience grief, delusion, anxiety in our lives. And that's why Bhagavad Gita is still relevant today. And the solution is Jiva Sadhana, which means these spiritual practices of letting go and becoming, letting go of this sense of limited sense of who I am. And that leads to liberation. So again, looking at it from a slightly different point of view, moksha is liberation, and then letting go, and through devotion, first of all, to the manifest divine, and then to the unmanifest substratum of existence, which is the divine. This is the complete solution to stress. Okay. But meanwhile, while we start practicing some of the techniques which I'm going to show you, this is the kind of overall view of the Bhagavad Gita. So the frameworks and skills for learning engine, how is this going to be done in our day-to-day life? Again, extracting this from the Bhagavad Gita, I have created this 4 A's of conscious living. Awareness, becoming more and more aware of ourselves, inner process, outer action. Alertness, becoming alert to where things are going wrong or mind is not working, paying attention, taking control of the intellect and the emotion and our action, and then doing the right thing at the right time. 4 B's of learning about letting go of the ego self. Background, what are my background? What is the background in this particular case? What are my beliefs? What is my behavior? What is the backwash? In other words, the reactions which are coming about. Through that, I can learn about myself. And through that, I can let go of the ego self. The 4 C's of commitment to a seeker's life, which is clarity, comprehension, conviction, commitment. And then 4 D's of the attitudes to sadhana and abhyas. I can't read the bottom lines, but I can tell you determination, devotion, discipline, and the 4th one, whatever it is. Okay, so now to take some example, here's an example of how all these things fit together. So remember, we've got a certain guidance from the Gita, which is an overall framework of inner transformation. And this overall framework is the basis on which the mind becomes so refined, it becomes purified. It becomes purified of our, beliefs about our individuality, beliefs about our limitedness, beliefs about our incompleteness. That process of purification then leads us to living a life of dharma. In other words, living a life of dharma will create this platform for inner purification. That inner purification in itself increases our capacity to deal with many, many, many things more than we were able to do before. Why? Because we have let go of this attachments which we have, and we have let go of this limited sense of who I am. And within this scheme, here's an example of one of the verses in chapter number 3, which is on Karma Yoga, and verse number 7. It says, whoever controlling the senses by the mind engages in action without attachment truly excels. So what is it talking about here? Controlling the senses by the mind. What do we mean by controlling the senses? Perception. When I see something and I perceive something as maybe this is the person I dislike very much, the senses are giving me this perception in the mind that here's somebody I don't like. When I control the senses by the mind, in other words, what the senses are giving me, I reconstruct that experience in a different way from what I'm used to. That is called control, and that is called cognitive control, that is called emotional regulation, that is called reforming my beliefs in that moment, and therefore controlling this by the senses, by the mind, has got this deeper meaning. And therefore, controlling my senses by my mind, I engage in action. And when I engage in action, it is no longer a reactive action, which is based on my past conditioning, but I have now given space for the mind to come up with the right response by this control of the senses, by the mind, controlling my thought process, controlling my feeling. And when I engage in action, that will be the right action. When I do it without attachment, then there is excellence in whatever I do. Perceived demand arises from attachment. Okay, so without the attachment, then that demand starts going down. Okay, and letting go of attachment will reduce the stress. So I hope you see this connection between the overview of the guidance which I gave you, the way in which attachment and identity becomes an issue with creating stress, and particularly attachment in this case is being talked about, and how to deal with our attachments. Doesn't mean we become detached as if we are not feeling anything or we are not going to do anything. There is a particular perspective which Bhagwad Gita talks about when he talks about detachment. It means that we retain an evenness of the mind, and with that kind of refocusing or re-evaluating our relationship with the people and the things and the situations around, I get to a certain different kind of relationship with the world around me. That is a kind of refocusing of my evaluation of things, which leads to this kind of detachment. So therefore, another example, therefore remaining unattached, always do the action worthy of performance. Engaging in action, truly unattached, man attains to the supreme God. Again, talking about our day-to-day transactions, our choices, this is part of action in chapter number 3, giving similar kind of idea about what it is, therefore remaining unattached, do the action worthy of performance, which is do your dharma, do things which ought to be done, and then engaging in action, truly unattached, we can rise to our divine nature. And reducing demand by letting go, increasing capacity by attaining a higher state of being, a higher state of consciousness, stress begins to diminish until it disappears. So do your best and leave the rest. Basically, that is what it means. Do your best according to the station and stage of your life and leave the rest. This is the way of dealing with stress. Another example, dedicating all actions to me with the mind centered on the self, free from expectation and ownership, free from tension, do what needs to be done. This is what I call the 5-point plan of our mindful living. 5-point plan of mindful living, guidance according to the Bhagwad Gita. This is a whole talk in itself. it's such a deep and rich kind of way of understanding our day-to-day life. So dedicating all actions to me, what does it mean? It means that there is a devotion to the higher ideal, a devotion to the higher self, a devotion to the divine. And taking ourselves to be the instruments of the divine. I say to myself, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm not being selfish and doing this for myself. I'm doing this for thee and thine. So from me and mine, we go to thee and thine, dedicating all actions to me, which takes away this limitedness of me doing my own silly things. Okay. With the mind centered in the self, with the mind which is centered in my higher ideal, my higher self. Free from expectation and ego identity, which are really the sources of our stress. Letting go, letting go. And then free from tension of the present moment. Do what needs to be done. So you can see this evenness of the mind can allow us to remain in a state of equilibrium with whatever we are dealing with, whatever needs to be done will be done. Living in this mindful way, a great way of managing and eliminating stress, and demand is greatly increased and the capacity, the demand is completely reduced and capacity is greatly increased. With an increased capacity and lowering of the demand, we have this way in which stress does not arise in ourselves. So how can I manage my stress on a daily basis? Do what you need to do and carry out your responsibility. Do it without expectation or attachment. Dedicate everything to a higher purpose, to God. Meditate daily and realize your true essence, your true self, and eliminate stress from your life completely. Of course, there's a huge journey to get to that state of realization of our inner self, true self. But like we say, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So what happens now when we follow this guidance? You're much happier, able to do more, remain calm even in difficulty, and you can manage stress effectively. Thank you very much.